doesn't matter. Testing, 1, 2. Testing. Hello.
Wow.
You're listening to WPVM LP in Asheville, North Carolina, 1037 on the dial, and globally at WPVMFM.org. And we have the Asheville Radio Museum dudes in here today, and we are just delighted to have them. We've got Stuart Smolkin and Peter Abzug, and they're here to tell us about the wonderful asset of that radio station over at AB Tech. So welcome, Stuart, and welcome, Peter. How are y'all doing today?
Doing well, Devine, thank you.
So pull the mic towards you a little bit more.
How's that?
About, like, see how close I am? Closer, yes.
Okay.
How are y'all doing today?
Doing well. Enjoying this cool
Good.
weather.
Yep.
So tell us where the museum is located, what you have in there. Give us the full rundown. So, and first of all, how did you get started with the station? How did you get started with radio?
I'll take that one. We actually opened as a museum. By the way, I joined this museum about 3 or 4 years ago, so I'm not a founder. But the founders put this museum together 21 years ago. We had our 20th anniversary last year. And the way it got started was a small group of amateur radio operators decided to open a museum. One of them was an instructor at AB Tech. There was an empty storage room there, and he asked the school for permission to use it to open a radio museum. And they said, okay, we'll give you a year, see how it goes. And here we are now, 21 years later. So I guess we're doing something right.
So what brought both of you to radio and the Radio Museum?
Peter?
Well, I just moved to Asheville a couple of years ago. I'm from Washington, D.C. I'm an amateur radio operator, and when I got here, just looking around to see what was in the vicinity, and when I saw that there was a radio museum, it was like the gates of heaven opened to me. So I ran over there and met the president, Ron Beaver, and he was giving tours that day, and I was just amazed at the depth of the radios that are in the museum, both on the amateur side and also on the commercial home side. So Ron said, well, you should come around for a meeting and see if you like it and maybe volunteer here. And I said, I sure will. I went, and I've been with them, I guess December will be 2 years. So it's a wonderful place for me.
And you kind of help do the marketing of the station on social media, don't you? So tell us where people, the listeners, could find out or find you on social media.
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, Stuart really established our social media presence. He asked me to take it to lessen his workload a little bit because he's the curator and he's very busy. We are on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube. You can also find us in travel apps like Yelp. We were just added to, what was that? The app where you drive, if you know you're going on a highway.
Roadside attractions?
Roadside attractions. They just added us a couple of weeks ago. So we're found there.
And don't forget Explore Asheville.
And Explore Asheville. And so we've really grown the presence, which has helped us a lot. We have Instagram followers from around the world, literally in the most unusual places, including Iran, India, Eastern Europe and so on, for people who may not even make it to Asheville, but just love looking at our collection.
Yeah, and on your website, you've got basically a tour of a lot of the artifacts and important or just the great collection that you have. So you've got a lot of that on that website, which is very informative.
That was Stuart's doing.
Well, it's a smartphone tour, so anyone with a smartphone can use an application that's available to download for free with instructions on our website. And it allows them to take a virtual tour of the museum as well as many other interesting places around Asheville.
So did you do the app? Did you do the app
They-
yourself, or did y'all hire someone?
The app is called Uniguide, and it was developed by a person who wanted to establish an application for museums and other places of interest around the country or the world for that matter. So last time I looked, I think there are about 18 different tours in the Asheville area. A person can download the app on their smartphone for free, and when it does, if you give the app permission, it will sense you're in Asheville. It will bring up a list of all the tours that are available in Asheville, and then you can select the Asheville Radio Museum or many other different ones as well.
That's interesting, because I'm going to be working on developing an app of the deep music culture that is in Western North Carolina, that basically the roots of rock and roll and folk music stem out of this area. So I'm doing my research now
I'll look forward to that one.
Yeah.
And so I'll check this out, because I was looking at Photoshop's app developer software, and boy, Photoshop is very clunky, I think, and complicated. Whereas if you've got something that it's got a template and you can just plug in your information, that's much easier to develop.
In the case of this one, the Uniguide, we provided the script and we provided the photos, and then on their end, they put the slideshow together
And
for
then
their
they
application.
upload it to like YouTube or iTunes and Google Play for you.
They're on their own website, as far as I recall, but they had a professional narrator just read our script, so it came out nicely.
Oh, good. Yeah. So, radio in general, how did both of you get involved in radio? Tell us your radio story.
You ever heard of the Boy Scouts?
Yes.
They have this thing called merit badges. So when I was a youngster and joined the Boy Scouts, wanted to earn a radio merit badge, and I was fortunate enough that in my neighborhood back then there was an amateur radio operator who was willing to take a group of Boy Scouts and teach them a bit about radio, enough to earn the merit badge. So that's how I got started. If you fast forward, I sold the radio equipment when I was a teenager to have money to date girls. And then after that happened, I grew up, moved to Asheville many years later, and decided I wanted to get one of my radios again that I used as a teenager. So bought it off of eBay, of course, and looked around in Asheville for somebody who could help me repair it. And after a lot of stumbling around, I finally heard about the Asheville Radio Museum and joined it, and they have allowed me to do a lot of things to take a diamond in the rough and turn it into one of the nicest radio museums in the country.
And you, Peter?
So I have to give my older brother credit for that. He's 11 years older than me. He passed away in 2021, but when I was a kid, a teenager, he gave me his Hallicrafter shortwave radio. It was a S85, and I just adored listening to shortwave, especially back in the 60s where there was no internet, and satellite broadcasts were just beginning. And this was a way to pick up the world, and I was just amazed to be sitting in my little room and hear stations from China, such as back then was known as Radio Peking, Radio Moscow, from behind the Iron Curtain, and it was just a miracle to me. And then years later, just out of a whim, I think, I decided to learn Morse code. and go for my novice license, and then eventually revved up to my general license, which
For
is
broadcasting?
for broadcasting, ham radio broadcasting, right? And that's where I am right now. There's one more level to go up, but I don't think I'm going to make that. It's a little too technical for me. But so that's really my connection. And my oldest brother, again, he was very good about talking about radio and teaching me. He had a major interest in radio. And I'll never forget, we were driving up, I grew up in New York, we were driving up the Palisades Parkway, he and I, and he said, look out of the window, you see that radio tower there? And I said, yeah. He said, that's on the campus of the local community college. That radio tower was Armstrong's first radio tower to beam FM signals in the 20s to his experimental receivers in Manhattan because it was a clear view. And so...
and where was that?
This is New Jersey.
In New Jersey?
Right.
Like
So,
across the river from New York City?
correct. The Palisades Parkway runs parallel with the Hudson River. And...
Oh, that's fascinating.
yes. And so he said, I remember him saying to me, now, do you know how many people don't realize that that was where the first FM broadcasts were?
Everybody.
Right. And you know, every time I pass that, now when I go upstate New York, I tell the kids and, you know, kind of point
I
it
think I would
out.
want to genuflect to it.
Excuse me?
Genuflect to it.
Oh,
Get out and
okay.
genuflect.
Anyway, so he was a real influence on my radio interest.
So, when you were listening shortwave to foreign countries, were they broadcasting in English, or were you just listening in the native language?
Oh no, they would broadcast in English.
Oh.
And especially the ones behind the Iron Curtain. If you ever wanted to know what the United States or your country was doing wrong, you tune into them, and they tell you everything that's
see.
bad
I
of
see.
America. So
Yeah, and so are you still tuning in to, like, are y'all still? I know you guys are ham operators.
Yeah.
Are you tuning in to what's being said in Russia about Ukraine?
ever since the internet, a lot of countries, including the BBC Foreign Service and stuff, have cut back or have eliminated their broadcasting over the air because it's uneconomical or what have you. And there are so many other alternatives now to get the message out. So it's very hard to find a foreign station these days. I don't know, Stuart, if you've had the same experience.
Well, as you were talking, Peter, I was just reminiscing about my own days as a teenager listening to the shortwave stations. And the thing that was so wonderful was stations like Radio Peking, if you contacted them by sending them a postcard or letter, they would send you the most beautiful literature on China. Not propaganda either, just really nice, beautiful things from China. I still recall how awestruck I was when I received that package.
I remember I got, Mao's Little Red Book, that they would have. They sent me a copy in English and told me, because as Stuart said, you'd send them a report and they'd send you what's known as a QSL card confirming that you were right. And as Stuart also said, they'd throw in some things. And they threw in one of those Mao Zedong books and told me that I needed to start to make a revolution in the United States, and wasn't my thing, but I still have the book, though.
Well, it's interesting that they were suggesting that, to say the least.
Yep.
So tell us a little bit about some of the artifacts in the museum,
Well,
and what's your favorite?
Well, I'll tell you about the star of the show, and then I'll tell you about a few others. But I'll also say that what people find fascinating at the museum is not just what we have on display, but the stories we tell. And so usually when a visitor comes to the museum, we try and find out what their interest is, and then we give tours to them that are tailored to their interest. So different people come in for different reasons. We get all kinds of visitors. Certainly we get our share of amateur radio operators that just want to look at the wall of equipment we have and see the equipment they used to use or the stuff they dreamed of but couldn't afford. And then we have people that come in just to admire the beauty of old radios, because back in the 20s and 30s, they were so much more nicer looking than they are today, where today they're just a utilitarian object. But back then, the companies competed by having beautiful cabinets to go along with their circuitry. In fact, Peter has been working with the Asheville Art Museum with the idea of putting a display of radios in the museum at some time, just to show the beauty of these things and show how the form followed the function as radio technology changed. So we have classes that come through. We've had history classes, science classes, music classes, and the stories we tell are all geared to their particular interest. So in terms of what we have that are favorites, I'll tell you a little bit about the Holy Grail. This particular radio, there are only 50 known to be in existence today. It is probably the most beautiful console radio ever created anywhere, and there are only 2 museums on the planet that have this radio on display. We are fortunate to be one of those 2 radio museums.
Was that the one that y'all put on Facebook just recently, that it was just
The
to die
stratosphere.
for, gorgeous?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
It is
So
the most.
yeah, check out their Facebook page and the museum page, but scroll through the WP to the Asheville Radio Museum's Facebook page, and you will come upon this stunningly beautiful radio that's priceless.
It is priceless, and it is incredibly beautiful. When Zenith made it in the middle 1930s, they were already competing against some other companies that were manufacturing high-end radios, and they wanted to compete. So they set out to design the most beautiful radio cabinet that they could. It's got 7 different types of wood veneer in it. And in addition to that, a regular radio at that time might have 6 tubes in it, maybe 7. This particular radio has 25 tubes in it and produces the most amazing, remarkable sound you can imagine for an AM radio, much less in the 1930s. And at the time, which is right after the Depression, this radio sold for $750 in the mid-1930s, when you could go out and buy a brand new car for less money than that. So it was only the very wealthy who could afford this radio, and that's why only 350 of them were ever manufactured. And today there's only about 48 of them that still exist in their complete form. And we play it for visitors when they come in, but most people just cannot believe how beautiful the thing looks.
Yeah, the face of it, where the controls are and the dials is bird's eye maple, I think.
Oh, a lot of different woods.
Yeah,
in
and then
there.
there's a lot of mahogany,
Right.
and just the workmanship on the wood itself is just phenomenal.
And the radio itself is in absolutely remarkable condition. It still has the original finish on it, which is so hard to believe.
Yeah, yeah, that makes it even more priceless.
And we're pretty
So-
picky when people come in the museum and start to lean on the top of it. We have
That's
to
like,
gently move
"Don't
their
lean
elbow
there."
away.
Stuart has yelled at me a couple of times because I've put my hand on there.
That's
so.
right.
Yeah, so where did that come from? Do you know who gave it, who donated it?
I do. It's the family of a gentleman named Steve Melvin, Melvin, and he passed away a year or 2 ago, and he was a radio collector, and in particular he focused on Zenith radios. So the family, when the house of Mr. Melvin was being emptied, they managed to contact us. I think they found us on the internet and told us that they had this radio. And I get calls like that every week and never know what they are. So I said, "What is it?" And he said, "Well, I think it's called a Zenith Stratosphere." So I contacted our museum president, a fellow named Ron Beaver, who's been involved in radio, amateur and vintage radios for decades. I said, "Ron, this guy just offered us a Zenith Stratosphere." He said, "Drop everything you're doing and go get that radio." So we were scrambling because this thing weighs a couple 100 pounds, and the family was emptying the house on a certain day, and this was 300 miles away at Kalawasi Island in South Carolina. And he said, if you want it, there's another museum that also wants it. And he said, well, you'll have to be here Saturday morning at 9 o'clock and be able to get it out of the house and transport it. So every time he asked a question, I said, yes, we will, yes, we will, yes, we will, and was able to persuade him that since his father was from the Carolinas, it'd be nice if the radio remained in the Carolinas. And we promised that we would make it the focus of our museum. The one we were competing against was a larger museum that already had 8 console radios on display. And I said, if you put your radio up there, it's just going to be one more console radio there. Whereas if you give it to us, it'll be the centerpiece of the museum. And he agreed with the logic, and that's how we got the radio. But just getting it out of his house and down eight steps and across 40 feet of yard and putting it into a horse trailer and bringing it 300 miles back was quite an adventure.
So how do you think radio technology is still relevant today?
May I take that one, Peter?
Please.
Thank you. We are an educational museum. It was one of my goals when I approached the original founders, is we wanted to make it educational. And one of the first things we try to do is to make people aware of how important radio technology is to all of our conveniences today. So in fact, when students come in, I actually give them a pop quiz on a sheet of paper, and it lists about a dozen things, and the point of the quiz is to find the one that does not depend on radio. And of course, the real answer is they all depend on radio. So just a few examples. We all use cell phones. That's a radio receiver and a transmitter. We all use GPS, or at one point we did, and that's based on radio communications. A lot of us use Bluetooth speakers, and that's radio communications. A lot of us have wireless internet routers in our house. That's radio. When we fly on planes and we want to be kept safe, they use radar, and that's radio. And so that's a half dozen examples, but there's many more.
Yeah,
So-
drone technology is...
Drone technology, any remote.
Transmit out.
Yeah. Tesla, I think, came up with the first remote control for a boat and showed that off in the early 1900s. But anyway, that's the first part of the educational process, is to make people aware of how important the technology is to us today. The other thing we do is try and help people understand how amazing radio waves are compared to a sound wave. A sound wave might die out as it goes through the air and can only go maybe 100 feet and still be heard unless you've got an amplifier, whereas a radio wave can travel through billions of miles of space. And the reason it can do that is because it's not a single wave, it's actually 2 waves. One is an electrical wave and the other is a magnetic wave. And as one part of the electrical wave dies out, it generates the next part of the magnetic wave. And as it dies out, it generates the next part of the electrical wave. So we can still receive satellite signals from satellites that are billions of miles away in space because of the amazing thing that radio waves are.
So that web, is it the web one that's out there
Yes.
now, way, way far away?
The Webb
And so
Space
that's
Telescope.
coming back on radio waves?
Yes, yeah,
Yeah.
digital, just like pictures are taken with your camera today. But you may recall a couple years ago, there was a discovery of either a new moon going around Pluto, I believe is what they discovered. And if you think about how far away Pluto is, and yet the pictures were sent back using radio waves.
You know, I'd like to just kind of add something to what Stuart's saying about when a visitor comes in, it's more than the radios, it's education. And one of the ideas that we try to tell people is how radio changed the socioeconomic situation in this country in the early 20s. The best example are farmers out where the only way they could get news or information was to go into the county seat, maybe pick up the county paper, and a lot of that news was 1 or 2 days old. When radio came in and they were able to afford a receiver, all of a sudden they started getting weather reports. So they knew how to take action. For example, if a frost was coming in, they were getting commodity prices, so they could think about when to sell their product. And there was also a government program in the early 20s and 30s that I think they would call it a farm college, where they would tell farmers, educate farmers on things like crop rotation, keeping your livestock healthy, these type of things. And with that, we all say the internet has made the world smaller, and it certainly has, but this was the first time the world shrunk, and then eventually with shortwave radio. But this helped to solidify communities and help to, help people feel a part of society. The other thing is part of the education is what Stuart was talking about, of how technology is used today with cell phones and so on. This all goes back to the early 1800s when a man, a British or an English scientist named Faraday, kind of put it together in his head, a theory about electromagnetic waves. And then later a Scottish physicist named Maxwell, who was very active interest in radio waves, put a mathematical formula to it, almost like how Einstein predicted black holes with just mathematical figures. He said, yes, Faraday is correct. And then a man named Heinrich Hertz, which people might recognize from megahertz or kilohertz, he actually built a transmitter, what's known as a spark transmitter, and a receiver to actually prove that Faraday was right. And at the museum, we have a replica of that, and we actually show people how the radio wave is created, and using just a handheld AM radio, how it's received. And people find that fascinating because a lot of us think, well, radio and electronics, this is something new or something. No, this goes back to 1830, I think, 1832. So it's very, very interesting. We try to put that all in context for our visitors.
Yeah, so if that got started in 1832, I think the first transmissions of a radio station was in like 1921 or 22.
1920 was when commercial broadcasting started in the United States. It was a station with the call sign KDKA, and it was in Pittsburgh.
Yeah,
or
Pennsylvania.
Pennsylvania, yeah.
Still
Yeah.
exists today.
Yes, yes. Still
Yeah.
transmitting.
Yep.
Still transmitting, and the story behind it is, I think, very interesting. That first of all, radio, when it first started with KDKA, became as popular and exploded in popularity the same way the internet did for us in our generation. We have a map on the wall at the museum that shows the number of radio stations in 1924, and there were hundreds of them that were broadcasting at that time. But the story behind KDKA is pretty fascinating. The first time the U.S. military started using radio was in World War I. And first of all, they didn't have any trained radio operators, so they put out the word to the amateur radio community saying, we really need volunteers to help us accelerate our ability to use radio. And I think something like 5,000 amateur radio operators volunteered to join the military for that purpose. But after the war, the military gave a contract to Westinghouse Corporation to try and improve their transmitters, and I think their receivers as well. And Westinghouse was in the radio business at that time. So there was an engineer there who was an amateur radio operator like Peter, and he started operating on the weekends, testing his newly developed transmitter by broadcasting music. And other amateur radio operators heard it and contacted him and said, gee, we'd like you to broadcast more music. So he goes into work and he's speaking with one of his bosses, who's a vice president, and not a radio guy, but a business guy. And he relays his experience, and the guy says, well, gee, maybe if we started a radio station, that'd give people more reasons to listen, and more people would buy the radios we're starting to make. And that's exactly what happened. They formed station KDKA, and the rest was history. So Asheville got its first radio station in 1927. Well, its first successful commercial radio station in 1927, which is still broadcasting today on AM radio. It's WWNC, which is wonderful Western North Carolina. And what some people don't realize, including me, was that at the time, radio stations were able to request their call sign. So as an example, Sears up in Chicago started a station called WLS, which is world's largest store.
So let me touch a little bit on WWNC, because we're in the self-help building here on Wall Street, and as I look out the studio window, I can see the Flatiron Building. Well, for several years, WWNC's station was in the Flatiron Building, and there were 100-foot antennas on top of the Flatiron Building. And because of that height, at the time, it was the highest station in the eastern part of the United States. And when they would send out their signal, it would hit the ionosphere, and they could pick it up down in Australia and other places around the world. And because of the height and the ability to transmit and go elsewhere besides the limited whatever their wattage was at the time, there were times whenever it was the 50%, the popularity of the station in the country, it was at 50%.
We have an interesting artifact in the museum in that regard. In the 1920s, many people made a hobby of saying how many radio stations across the country they could listen to. And if you heard a station, you could send a request to that station for what was called a verified reception stamp. It looked like a regular postage stamp, but it was to verify that you had heard a broadcast from that station. And there was actually a magazine in those days that was trying to attract subscribers. And so if you subscribed, they would give you a free catalog with a page for each state where you could paste your postage stamps onto the label for the station you had heard. So what we have at the museum, and this is to the story you just told, it's a postcard that was sent by WWNC to a listener in Connecticut who had requested a verified reception stamp. And the reply on the postcard is hand-typed, and it fills the entire postcard, and they're thanking them for listening. And what it says on the postcard is, we're not actually officially broadcasting yet. What you heard was a test broadcast, and we hope you will listen to our premiere broadcast, which is coming up. So if anyone is interested in WWNC and a little bit of the stories about them from the newspapers, we have about a dozen articles on WWNC that are on our website, and the website is avlradiomuseum.org. So AVL like the airport, AVL Radio Museum, all one word, .org. And if you go to the topics menu and click on WWNC, you'll see those stories. There's also a link on that same menu for farm radio, which mentions and gives articles from the early 1930s newspapers, Asheville Citizen-Times in particular, about the value of radio to farmers, just as Peter described. One story that we tell that people find interesting is that many people in the 1920s were on rural farms and isolated. There are actually, according to the news article I read, there are like 30 million or more people living on rural areas, farms or small towns in the 1920s. And so radio opened up the world to them. They could actually hear church services or political speeches or entertainment of various types. And so everybody wanted to have a radio. So the early radios in those days were called crystal radios. And the government actually published plans in the 1920s where you could get an empty oatmeal box from mom and go to the hardware store and buy a length of wire and wrap it around the oatmeal box and buy an inexpensive headset and a what's called a crystal, and you would have a radio for just a few dollars, and that's why radio became popular even in the poor rural counties.
Well, that is fascinating. It seems to me like I visited the museum one time, and you were telling me, I think you told me that you tried to build your own crystal set, but it didn't quite work. Was that you?
Well, I don't think that was me. I built one as a Boy Scout back in those days.
Uh-huh.
And we actually have one of those 1950s crystal radio kits from the 1950s. So I think I got that one working, got my merit badge at least.
Oh, well, good. Well, that's the important thing. So, what's Peter? What's your favorite part of the station or of the museum? You can tell I've got radio head here. So, what's your favorite part of the museum?
Well, I love all the radios there. So to me, that's like picking your favorite child.
It's the whole. It's the whole
It's
thing.
the whole thing. I think my favorite part of volunteering there and working there, there are about 10 of us. We all, have different times we give tours. Is our visitors' reaction, not only to seeing the radios themselves, and as Stuart said, seeing amateurs going in there and seeing the radios they had as a kid, or the beautiful radios that are there. That is that's my favorite part. And I have found, which is kind of interesting, because what I sense is when, let's say, a couple comes, a man and a woman, husband and wife, you could tell that the reason why they're there is mostly because of the husband, because he has the interest in the technology and likes to look at this. And occasionally, his wife will be out in the hall and say, look, do your thing. I'll be here. I'm going to go on my phone. And so I'll try to get her to come in, and she will. And we start telling the stories like we've been telling today, and putting all what this technology and its influence on society and individuals, their lives. And all of a sudden, it's like seeing a flower blossom. They want to learn more and more about this. And a couple of times, by the time this couple leaves, you would think it was her idea to come and visit us at the museum, because she was just so thrilled about it. And so glad to learn so much. So that's my favorite part, are the visitors that come.
I'm going to echo that. Our slogan is, we amaze, fascinate, and educate. And that's what we try to do when people come in. And it's just, because Peter and I and the other volunteers have such a passion about this, we always enjoy sharing what we know with people who find it to be so interesting. I had a couple from Ohio that came to visit the museum on Monday, and we started talking, and 3.5 hours went by. Just with that one couple. And then on Wednesday, I had another couple come in from Florida, and before we knew it, we've been chatting with each other for something like 2.5 hours. So it's just a thrill to have people come in. Again, different groups, different interests, but they all leave saying, we are so glad we found your museum. It's one of the most fascinating places we've ever seen, and thank you for sharing all the stories with us.
Oh, well, that's wonderful. Really wonderful. So, tell people how to get to the museum.
That's the hardest part, but I'll make it as easy as I can. First of all, we have very detailed directions on our website. So if someone goes to our website, which is avlradiomuseum.org, and they go down on the homepage to the bottom where we have the map, there's a link actually at the top as well for directions that takes them step by step. The easy answer is you set your GPS for 16, like Sweet 16 Fernihurst Drive. Fernihust Wurst Drive. That's the address of the parking garage at AB Tech. And we're right across the greenway in the building called the Elm Building, ELM, like the tree. And we're in room 315. The other thing I want to mention, since I'm mentioning AB Tech, is we are so extraordinarily grateful for having them host us and for everything they do for us. They are so incredibly supportive. The department chair, the dean, and the instructors are just, we're all friends at this point, and we all just so much appreciate what these folks do for us.
Just want to add in the hours that we're open, and it's Saturdays from 1 to 3.
And as mentioned, we do take special appointment requests, primarily for out-of-towners who just are not here on a Saturday. But we get so many messages from people that see our website or hear about us or whatever, and they say, I've got a spouse who's a ham, and I so want to take them to your museum and make it a surprise. Is there any way you can open up? And we always say yes.
Always open up for anybody.
So you'll open up for one-on-one and special
Absolutely.
visitors.
Absolutely.
So you've got the Antique Radio Fair coming up.
Yeah, but
Let's go ahead.
I'll mention that. Before I leave that, though, I just want to make sure that your audience understands that we love giving tours to small groups as well. And so we have church groups that come in sometimes. We have the Asheville Historical Society come in. I'm hosting a tour Friday of a group from an elderly home. So we welcome those types of groups. The museum is not large, so we can only take about 8 or 10 people at a time. But if anybody out there were just looking for an interesting place to visit, we welcome that. The Vintage Radio Fair, or Vintage Radio Market, is something that our president, Ron Beaver, who's an experienced ham, decided we should offer, and we did it last year. And I think we had something 100 people, plus or minus, that came from the entire surrounding area, including Georgia, South Carolina, parts of North Carolina, and Tennessee. And it's an opportunity for people who are interested in buying and selling or swapping vintage radio equipment to come and set up a table or out of the trunk of their car, and people seem to really enjoy that type of thing.
Or just looking at them.
Or just
looking,
exactly.
admiring the radios.
Yes.
And what's the date on that?
It's October 15th from 8 o'clock until 1 o'clock. And there's no charge for bringing with your stuff to try and sell, and there's no charge for walking through. It's just strictly a public event.
Well, that ought to be fun for people.
I think so. Oh, by the way, we also, if people have an old radio that they inherited from grandma or grandpa, they just want to know some information about it, if they're able to put that radio in their vehicle and bring it, we'll do our best to help them.
Or a photo of it.
Yeah, identifying. And, as important as our phones are today for being connected to the world, and radios in our grandparents and our parents and our time were our connection to the world. And so that's basically how it all began. Your phone now is our radio is your phone now.
It was, and it actually changed the culture of the country. And Peter touched on this a little bit earlier. People in the 20s used to think of themselves as being, well, I'm a Madison County person, or I'm a whatever, but they're basically focused on their county. Whereas when they had a radio in their home and they're getting world news from all around the country, it really helped people think of themselves as being Americans, as opposed to being residents of a particular county.
Mm-hmm. So I had a friend who is also in radio. We're affiliated with the Pacifica Network, which is stations all around the country like ours. And she is the affiliate manager, and she was in Switzerland, up in the mountains, and she said, up there now, because of the internet, they're hearing the exact same news that we hear in the States. So that connectivity from, I'm a Madison County person to I'm an American, that communication now is changing to the point where we're all in the same world, basically.
I wish the Russian population could make that claim as well. I'm afraid they can't.
Don't we all?
Mm-hmm.
Don't we all, for goodness sake? Well, I want to thank you both for coming in it's just an honor to have you here.
Thank you.
And
Thanks.
and you radio people should consider doing something on the radio. We have a lot of time, and we have a lot of flexibility.
Well, before you let us go, I have to mention that 1946 jukebox we have that is starting to really amaze
Oh,
people
yeah.
as well.
Yes. Yeah,
This
let's
is-
talk about that.
Well, it's an amazing piece of equipment. The 1940s were considered to be the golden age of jukeboxes
Right.
because the companies competing like Rockola and Wurlitzer were trying to make their jukeboxes as attractive as possible so people would come over and put their coins in. So the jukebox that we were donated recently is a 1946 Rockola. And strangely enough, the man who founded the company's name was David Rockola, and I'm not making this up. So he called his jukebox the Rockola. And it's one of these old, amazing machines where the records are all in a stack. And when you select your record, the record tray swings out of the stack, the turntable comes up from underneath and lifts it to the tone arm to play, and then everything happens in reverse when the record is finished. So it's an amazing machine to see, and really a beautiful piece of equipment as well.
I just want to put a shout out to you and this station. I've listened to WPVM since I arrived here. Again, like the Radio Museum, it was just that, happy discovery, serendipity, if you will. And I think stations, free-form stations, like WPVM, are not very, there aren't a lot of them in the country, and I was so glad, being an ex-WBAI New York radio fan, to have a station that plays such a variety of programming, not only from Pacifica, but in music, where, I think I mentioned this to you, where it doesn't matter if it's Frank Sinatra, the Beatles, or Megadeth, or whatever. If the song is good, if it's quality, you guys will play it, sometimes in, the same 10-minute segment, and it's such a breath of fresh air when you compare it to the programming that's done in a corporate headquarters, and it's really great. So personally, I thank you for being on the air.
Well, we are we're called a low power station. These stations were developed to bring radio back into local community because commercial stations were pretty much bought out in the 80s and 90s and became kind of homogenized around the country. And so people started lobbying because they missed the local aspect of radio. And so they began lobbying in the 90s to get this designation, a low power designation, so that you would have radio stations back in the community. And currently there are a little over 2,000 licenses that are out, that are owned by or held by different organizations. About 1,000 of them are churches. Maybe 200 or 300 are held by colleges and universities. Then there's a section of Indian reservations and stations that are stations associated with the NAACP. We are considered basically totally independent, that we're not under the umbrella of any other entity. And there are only 60 of us in the country that are totally independent. Mm-hmm. So it's an interesting classification for radio. So again, I want to thank you both for coming in, and I want people to really take advantage of the excellent asset the Asheville Radio Museum is to the community, and the great people associated with it who are so passionate about the medium. So we'll return to our regular broadcasting now. You're listening to WPVM 1037 in Asheville, North Carolina. And here's the music.
Now you're